the productivity level in two different countries. We begin with our equation, which we just had from the last page. Now let's just put two countries, one on top of each other. We'll put Zambia or Zimbabwe on the top, the U.S. on the bottom. Here's our equations for the two countries. Okay. Now what we want to do is divide both sides of the equation by this material in order to isolate the productivity differences. We do that, we get this equation down here. Now, how do we interpret this? Well, let's suppose that the output per worker in Zambia were half that in the United States. Okay? If the ratio of the factors of production were also half, so the top figure here, if this were a half, if the ratio of the factors of production were also a half, then this would be 1. This would say that the productivity levels in the United States and Zambia were the same. So in other words, if output per worker was a half, but you had half the human capital and you had half the physical capital, then you can explain all of that difference without resorting to differences in productivity. On the other hand, suppose that Zambia had the same levels of human and physical capital as the United States, so that this number was 1. They still had, however, half the output per worker. That means that the productivity level in Zambia must be half that of the United States. Okay? So this is just a simple way of dividing differences in output per worker in terms of those differences which can be explained by differences in the factors of production, and any remaining difference which must be due to differences in productivity. Now let's look at what happens when you apply this exercise empirically to data from the world. So in this table we do some productivity accounting. And this table, by the way, is from David Wall's book, Economic Growth, which I've already mentioned as being a very good book. Okay, here's how you read the table. What this table tells us is that in Mexico, output per worker is 0.29 the level in the United States. So the United States is defined here arbitrarily as being equal to 1, and the level in Mexico then is equal to 0.29, about 30% of the level in the United States. Now why? Why is output per worker in Mexico so low? Well, in part, it's because Mexico has lower physical capital per worker. They also have lower human capital per worker. Together, the factors of production explain about half of Mexico's level of GDP per capita. In other words, what this tells us is that if Mexico had the same physical capital per worker as the United States, the same human capital per worker as the United States, its output per worker would still be about half the level in the U.S. So what accounts for the remaining half? Well, the remaining half is accounted for by productivity. Okay? Together, it's productivity and the factors of production which explain why GDP per capita is 0.29 that of the United States. So not only does Mexico have less physical capital per worker and less human capital per worker, it combines its capital in less efficient ways. It uses its capital less productively, with lower productivity. And that it's both of these factors. Both of these factors account for the differences in GDP per capita. And what you see over here is that differences in productivity across countries measured in this way are surprisingly large. So even Canada, which is relatively similar to the United States, has a productivity level 20% below that in the United States. Zambia has a productivity level which is only 15% that of the productivity level in the United States. So that means that Zambia is labeling under two really big problems. It's got less physical capital, less human capital, and it combines the capital that it does have in a very inefficient way. Now, there's lots that could be said about this table. How well are we actually measuring human capital per worker? How well are we measuring physical capital per worker? Remember, productivity here is what we can't explain. So productivity is what's left over. Maybe if we have mismeasurement, maybe the productivity level would be lower. Nevertheless, I think it's quite accurate to say that productivity levels differ tremendously across countries. And the reason I think this is true is that we have not simply macroeconomic evidence for this, but it's consistent with the microeconomic evidence that we have as well. Let's take a look. So here we're showing some data from William Lewis's book, The Power of Productivity, on productivity levels in Japan compared to the United States. Now, compared to the U.S. productivity level of 100, what we see is that Japan did extremely well in steel, automotive parts, metalworking, cars, and consumer electronics. This makes sense. After all, we know that Japan exports a lot of these goods, which suggests that they're able to produce more at lower costs. And that's exactly what the productivity differences show, that Japan is able to produce more valuable output using less valuable inputs than in the United States. But what about the rest of Japan? What we also see in this graph is that these industries accounted for just a little bit over 10% of the employment in Japan. So these industries, although we think of them as representing Japan Inc., these industries are actually pretty small relative to the whole Japanese economy. So what does the rest of the Japanese economy look like? Well, astoundingly, it looks like this. Take the retail sector. The retail sector is huge, about 50% of the entire Japanese economy, and its productivity level is half that of the United States. Housing and construction, another huge industry. Productivity levels much lower than in the U.S. Food processing, about 30% productivity level compared to the United States. And notice that food processing has about as large an employment effect as steel, automotive parts, metalworking, and cars and consumer electronics all combined, about the same size. So what accounts for these big differences in productivity? Well, looking at the retail sector, a short way of putting it is Japan doesn't have Walmart. Japan has millions of mom and pop shops. And the problem is that these mom and pop shops are really inefficient. They use a lot of labor and, relatively speaking, a lot of capital to not sell very much. As a result, productivity is really low. Now, why is this? Well, one reason is that for many, many years it was illegal to have a retail store in Japan which was larger than 1,000 square meters. This was finally gotten rid of in 2000 under U.S. pressure, but through a combination of land use regulations, of subsidies, and of licenses and regulations at the local level, the retail sector has remained moribund. The retail sector has remained full of mom and pop shops. Now, mom and pop shops may sound nice, but if you don't have Walmart, then you also don't have Walmart putting pressure on all of its consumer manufacturers to increase productivity, to reduce costs, and reduce prices. So the retail sector has knock-on effects. When you have a poor retail sector, when you have an inefficient retail sector, you get an inefficient sector manufacturing consumer goods. So this helps to explain why Japan has a lower GDP level per capita than in the United States. They've got the human capital, they've got the physical capital, but through a whole bunch of licenses and laws and regulations and restrictions, they're not using their physical and human capital up to its greatest potential. So all of these restrictions on how you can combine capital and labor, this creation of monopolies, feather bedding, the labor unions, restrictions on whom you can hire and whom you can fire. All of these restrictions reduce the efficiency with which capital and labor are combined, reducing productivity, and that has a big effect on GDP per capita. All of these things are going to depend upon incentives, and incentives are going to depend upon institutions. Things like the rule of law, open and competitive markets, an honest government, a non-corrupt government, and so forth. So the Solow model, it's a great way of organizing our thinking about economic growth. It points us directly to physical capital and to human capital. Indirectly, we've seen that these alone are not enough to explain, so we've got to start talking about organization and productivity. That brings us to thinking about incentives, and that brings us to thinking about institutions.